Hey Aquinas, hey Elizabeth. We are going to have a chat today about a topic that is really something that we have some mixed opinions about, and yet it's very much related to the work we do. It has to do with education funding and where potentially public dollars, well, it's generally sometimes called the topic of school choice. The idea that right now, dollars are allocated largely based on the districts where students live, their local government run schools across most states in the United States. There's a lot of controversy around whether or not families should have options that are taxpayer funded, other than the traditional public school to which the district to which the family is assigned based on where they live. There's a lot behind this. I'm still formulating my kind of position on the topic, although I have some ideas that I want to think through. And I want to just have a really almost like a dialogue and a discussion about this to see if we can explore this a little bit. It's not that we're trying to convince anyone of anything on this topic, but it's also to model how to have a caring discussion on something that is it can get political. There are a lot of beliefs around this. So I wonder, Elizabeth, because you have you have also spoken to many people about the idea of school choice. Can you give us some of your understanding about what the topic is and what are some of the main positions of especially the homeschooling families that you've spoken with?
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting that because I feel like I have spoken to people on kind of, well, I was going to say both sides, but I think there's more than two sides to the issue for sure.
Mhm.
So in the homeschooling world, there's kind of, I've met people who are, all for it, who would love to have funds to be used for, whatever they want to do for homeschool. Um, I have provided services to homeschoolers who have been using funds from the government for education. And I've met homeschoolers who, while they homeschool, they still have concerns about what this will do to the public school system, that it will kind of leave a situation where all the people who can leave do leave, and the people who cannot don't. Like we have the situation here in Iowa where in the past couple of years, they did release funds for people to go to accredited public school or private schools using the funds from the public education system. And consequently, what happened is a lot of the private schools raised their tuition.
Mm.
So that still left it so that like then the private school's tuition was still more than what the funding was given to families, and it still left people in a position where, okay, it was only still more well-off people are able to do this because they're still out of pocket even for a private school. And then I have met people who are kind of really against it on the basis of that this will lead to more government control of homeschooling and alternative education. So the idea that if you're accepting public funding for something you're doing in education, that the federal government will then come and impose standards on what you're doing. Whereas, say, in a lot of states, there are some states where homeschoolers are required to do testing or reporting of some kind. In Iowa, there's kind of like a variety of ways to do that. But even if you are doing testing, you're at least still not really, like, your actual curriculum is not controlled as far as you get to teach what and how you are teaching their kids. And the metric for any testing or reporting that you're doing is just that the child is making progress. So yeah, there's kind of, I'd say that's at least like three sides of the issue that I've come across. And I was sharing a little earlier is that for myself, there are states that are just giving funds to homeschoolers to kind of use for a variety of things. Like here in Iowa, it has to be an accredited private school, but I know there are other states that are just getting funds and you can use it on curriculum different things, but they, for the most part, which understandably so, are still limited to particular things, particular online courses or curriculum or things that are very clearly educational. Whereas myself and a lot of people I know that kind of did more unschooling, relaxed homeschooling, um, it wouldn't have been very useful for most of the things that I wanted to spend money on for my kids. Like just perhaps buying more books or buying, subscriptions to things like the zoo or whatever. So that's what I had always kind of looked at as like, oh, that'd be nice, but I'm not sure it'd be as useful. But at the same time, like the question is, should it just be a blank check that's given per student? I tend to think that if the public school education the public education system exists as it does, and there is funding that is presumably per child, then that should be dispersed to the child. But you do kind of understand that there's a lot of people that will misuse that without oversight. Absolutely, there is. So I think it's a difficult situation. And I know Aquinas has some other views that I'm interested to hear. But yeah.
I guess I'll get started. So, like I said beforehand, I've been advocating against school vouchers for close to 25 years now, like publicly writing articles and so forth. And my framework of looking at any kind of educational issue, especially related to public schools or related to tax money for any kind of schools, is my view is there should be a separation of school and state, that it is not proper for the government to be involved in education at all. So when I'm analyzing any policies, I am looking at it from that perspective. So now seeing what's going on with people, you say the term school vouchers, and I think that's not really accurate. I think it's more accurate to say something like government financed and defined school vouchers, because it's the tax money and it's the government determining, based on certain criteria at the moment, where that would qualify. Another aspect I want to bring up is a lot of times in the rhetoric for the school choice advocates, they will say, you're getting your money back to do this. And to me, that's actually disingenuous, because it is not their money in the sense of, when you look where the majority of tax money comes for that's allocated to education by the government, the primary funding mechanisms are property taxes and state income taxes. And in the states that don't have the income tax, there's a sales tax component. So when you look at where all that money is coming from, you have people who are funding through taxation who don't have children, or who have children that are outside of the scope that would be served by education. You also have companies. A big portion of that income tax money is coming from companies. So again, the money is not theirs, these parents. If they looked at their tax bill and saw the exact percentage that is coming from their own personal property taxes and their income taxes, especially if they're in the lower income brackets, they are getting a subsidy themselves from the government. And then when you look at the recipients, primarily schools, private schools or services, they are getting a subsidy from their own perspective, also a government subsidy for for those services and or products. So, that's the framework I'm looking at it from, and what I think is actually happening. And then Elizabeth brought this part up. In almost all of the instances, there is a component of oversight that has to do with qualifications for it, whether that be certain kind of testing requirements. What's the other big one? I forgot what you said, Elizabeth. I should know off the top of my head. Accreditation. And so that's how it will start. But understandably so, even though I don't think there should be any tax money going to education, it'll be understandable that people will want requirements or I'm sorry, oversight about how is that money going to be used, because, it might be used for whatever. There have been instances where parents, use that money to do like a Disney trip, and sure, you could like form some kind of like, we're getting some kind of education thing. And I would not try to argue personally against that, because in many ways, learning and education can happen in all kind of environments. But again, if it's tax money, someone else is going to look and go, does that really qualify? And inevitably what happens when it comes to government subsidies of any type, controls grow. So it'll start with those two. I did a public post on X because I'm so against it. I go, watch, in Texas is about to implement on a wide scale. And I list like 3 other things where I put a public $1,000 bet that in 10 years, these things will happen. They'll be about teacher accreditation component. If the schools are accredited of a certain way, the teachers themselves, eventually, depending on which political parties are in charge in those areas, there'll be curriculum requirements. When I say curriculum requirements, I'm not necessarily saying super micromanaging, but it'll be in some parameter that whoever's in power has determined. And, to give examples, if let's say you're in an American red state, a lot of conservatives might be okay with those particular parameters, but people might, Democrats on the left, how you want to label them, they were like, no, those are not fair. So you're just going to expand government control where, right now it's just within the public school system. Now, because the money has gone outside of it, that control will now be over private schools eventually, initially by those first couple of criteria. But if you look historically, anytime the government starts giving you money, it starts exerting control. And then another thing that Elizabeth brought up, I know she didn't use this word, it is a subsidy for the private schools. And that will cause the tuition to rise, of course, just like with colleges and universities, which this other thing I'm also against, there are federal backed loans. And if those colleges and universities know that the government is guaranteeing the payment of that tuition, then the original average floor of whatever their tuition, and we have seen it historically, has risen up. And that's always what subsidies do. They raise the price. So, that's I can keep going.
Well, one thing that this conversation is already starting to reveal is that having, let's say, beliefs that involve education at the policy level have such an intersection with like other beliefs and almost like political like principles, and you almost can't separate the two. So like Aquinas, so you're broadly like for like a great deal of separation and almost like a hands-off approach from government almost having any part in families' education. Is that right?
Right. I would say on principle, because of my own political philosophy based on individual rights, that it is not a proper function of government.
So, the reason why I bring this topic up is, I'm a product of public schools, and
Me too.
yeah, and what I'm seeing now with particularly the homeschooling families that we're working with, there are a few labels for this type of homeschooling family. Like I don't know if it's secondhand, but basically you were in the public system and you felt the need to escape. And what I'm seeing is that these families are lacking resources and support, particularly with financial resources, to be able to afford tutors, supplies, paying out of pocket for food now, and all of those things. And I believe that young people should have access to education. Where that gets funded from, I'm indifferent on. So, for example, if it comes from something that's publicly funded versus, I don't know, private donors, like I would be open to, thinking about where, like, does it matter to me where exactly it comes from? I think in part, the accountability piece is something that I think probably should be in place. Like I wouldn't want students to be unsafe, for example, or not advancing in moving toward life readiness. What exactly does that mean year to year? I think that's something that is maybe a different discussion, but the general principle of like having access, but some sort of, you know, level of accountability, that's kind of broadly where I sit right now. But what are some of our beliefs about like whether or not we think that all families or all students should have some sort of, I don't know, let's say a right to educational opportunities? And
I have to leave in a minute here, so I'll just chime in real quick. But yeah, I think that's a really difficult one because I would say it's sort of like I think it's a human right in the sense that, you know, people should be able to live and learn and flourish, you know, but I also believe sort of human rights of like housing and being able to eat. Now the question is, does that mean that the government should be providing that? That's a question I don't know that I have firm in my mind because I've also seen the detrimental effects of that as well. And I've also seen almost like a devaluing of education because it's just assumed that the government is going to provide this for children. And I think that's one of the biggest um, sort of complaints that I hear from public school teachers is that children are really struggling in their education because families aren't supportive of it because they don't view that as their job anymore. They view this as the government's job. And, you know, I want all families to be supported in education. You know, I don't think that everyone should homeschool the way I did. You know, I absolutely know that not all families can or should have a parent that stays at home and educates their children. That was hard enough for me. And I had, you know, more resources than a lot of people to do that. So, yeah, I feel conflicted, I think. And a lot of that, I don't think it's an easy, you know, there's no kind of easy solution there. But I have to run, so carry on, and I'll watch the rest of this later.
Thank you for your contribution, Elizabeth.
Mhm.
So we're you know, there are these two types of rights that like from what I understand, Aquinas, and you can kind of correct me if I'm wrong. And I think the phrase is like a positive versus a negative right, or maybe more specifically, it's like a right as something you're allowed to do. So like freedom of speech, like, you know, you can say things, but it doesn't require that anybody gives you anything. But something like, you know, Elizabeth was mentioning the right to housing. Well, it's like, okay, well, if you believe in the right to housing, that means someone else is going to be required to give up something like public dollars or whatever resources. And so that's starting to become, you know, the heart of what we're talking about. Like, does education access mean that other people need to contribute, or is there some, I don't know, moral duty that, you know, Elizabeth was mentioning that some parents don't really believe it's their job to kind of like fully educate their children, and that's what the schools do. Already this is like blowing up so many different things to talk about. What are some of your thoughts, Aquinas, about education as a right or anything else related to this conversation? And I know, Jed, you're kind of just listening right now, and I want you to participate too.
Yeah,
I've definitely heard the phrasing negative and positive rights. I would never describe actual rights that way. And you're right. When people claim like a right to housing, a right to education, a right to food, my understanding, and you know, if by chance that might include you or Jed, that means that by the nature of just me being a human, I am deserving of that regardless of almost anything, like regardless of my ability to provide for myself for those things. And I definitely disagree with it, that rights can never be formulated where it lays a claim on someone else's wealth, savings, or work. Like that is not, that's just someone saying, I need that, I want that, but that doesn't constitute an actual right. Now, obviously, there are people who do think that that constitutes a right, but they are also, I mean, you know, we could get deeper because there's an underlying morality to that kind of a claim, which basically, and you could correct me if you don't think I'm summarizing, encapsulating this, is almost like we have a moral duty to be helping the less fortunate. And my particular morality that I ascribe to and live through, you know, these last 30 years or so is no, that is not, you don't get to make a claim on my life. Like, where did I sign that contract that like you get to have my stuff just because you need it? With that said, and when I say with that said, it's very important for me to get the point across that rights are not claims on other people, including their labor, their wealth. Again, to my morality, we are not our brother's keeper. So again, with that said, I am very supportive of charity. And I obviously, Jimmy, I know you have done charitable things, very charitable things. And if we could get to a separation of school and state, and historically, even if we look at before there was a proliferation of public schools, going back to some of the cities in America in the late 1800s and early 1900s, charitable organizations arose because people were so bothered by, you know, poor, less fortunate, if you want to say it, not having that kind of access. And so kind of my retort is, if that bothers you so much, then open up your own wallet. And Jimmy, to your credit, you know, you had a situation where something bothered you a lot, and you wanted that person to have a better quality of life. And admirably, you opened up your own wallet to help, you know, change that circumstance.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so you basically, this concept that is sometimes called positive rights, or, you know, I don't know if the word entitled is the word, but where, you know,
an entitlement.
Yeah, basically an entitlement. So you're kind of like, you only believe in what's called like negative rights or non-interference.
I think it's the idea that rights can only be taken away. You can't give them to someone.
I wouldn't say like give
like you can't depend on someone else to give you your right. That person can only at worst take it away. Your right is already with you. It's something you already have innately, as opposed to you're waiting for someone to give it to you.
I would be careful to say innately, because I don't view, however this sounds, rights as being God-given. They're a conceptual formalization, meaning we are now in society. What are appropriate ways for us to be interacting? And for my philosophy of individual rights, the broadest kind of sphere of this is like, you cannot like use force on me or commit fraud against me. Other than that, then we go forward in our life and we voluntarily interact with people. When it comes to businesses, we might form contracts, but it's always voluntarily participation, voluntarily exchange.
It's not an innate one then, just that rule that it's got to be voluntary, or is that like whatever's useful to society too? Because one thing Elizabeth said before she left was that the culture's kind of shifted a bit, where now even parents start to worry it's the government's job to teach my kid all these things. So we can say, oh, get rid of all these failing schools and stuff, and the public and charities and kind of personal communities will pick up the slack. But I worry that we've shifted so far culturally now that we'd be having to go through quite the transition phase, where it might actually be more suitable now to stay with traditional education than completely burning it to the ground, just because the culture that would come into place isn't really here right now. We'd have to work the culture up first, so that when the transitional schools do go down, there's actually a net there.
I would say I disagree. I would say the culture, if you view it as kind of on a downward trajectory, is partly because of this idea that people have a right to other people's stuff, and that has created a widespread entitlement mentality. If you don't mind me shifting back to education and the separation of school and state, my primary advocacy to get there is to loosen regulations on the formation of private schools, to cut taxation that's allocated to public schools, that frees up capital for potential entrepreneurs to be able to offer those kind of services. So, and then the third one is we need to ideally get rid of the compulsory education laws. But as an interim step, I would love to see the age range that is applicable for those to continuously shrink. So like in America, I believe most of the compulsory attendance laws go from like 6 to 16. I think they should all be gone. I think it's horrible that kids are forced to attend school. But if we can make that range keep getting smaller, instead of 6 to 16, it becomes 8 to 14, then it becomes 10 to 12 until we finally get rid of it. So if you have those three things start to progress, then you would have that shift and people knowing that we're headed that way. Of course, the likelihood of this happening would be more people, frankly, would have some of my view to enable that. And as that progress is happening, those most concerned about the less fortunate and who have the means, which could be a Jimmy, would go, I see this transition happening. It seems like as that transitioning is happening, especially with the cutting of taxes, because that will mean less overall money, tax money going to public schools. And if Jimmy or Jed, y'all had the resources and like, well, that's going to affect that single mom or that one, then I would say, open up your wallet or form organizations voluntarily. So to start giving scholarships or financial support or personal time with those people. I don't think you can. Go ahead, Jed.
I'll be speaking from ignorance, obviously, a bit here. So forgive any idiot questions, just because in the UK, I assume it's quite different. But when you say kids are forced to go to school there from 6 to 16, can you not homeschool your kids from that age?
You can homeschool, but you still have to be like doing some kind of school with your kids. And depending on the states, that kind of oversight can vary, but there's still an expectation that you have to be doing some kind of schooling. Again,
it's like you can homeschool. You don't get any help with it, really, but I think you get like a yearly check-in, but there's not like a curriculum that homeschoolers are given here. So would this be more your ideal situation, I guess, in the UK, where we can teach them whatever they like and you just get a check-in to make sure?
One thing I want to add to that compulsory is, if you're in the public schools as a kid, you cannot choose, like, I'm only going to be, let's see, and Jimmy could be more exact on this. If there's 180 days of attendance for the public school and your parent decides, you know what, you can have Mondays and Fridays off. Me as a parent, I've decided the public school will get you for truancy, and depending on which kind of state you're in, or which of the states you're in, you might get arrested for that as a parent.
Yeah, that can happen.
What are benefits to that though? Where like if you're training kids up for jobs, would you be like, well, you couldn't get a job and then say, oh, I only want to work these 3 days. Those others that you're asking for, I'd rather just not turn up. Because Jed,
the difference there is the job is a voluntary association. You're choosing to work.
School when you first go in, I mean.
No, but I'm saying
you're held to that standard.
No, but Jed, it's not the same because you're being forced to pay for it, even if you didn't like it. In the job market, there's no one forcing you and saying, this employer wants you as an employee and you're stuck inside this job. It's all voluntary. You can decide.
I mean, in terms of if you can homeschool, then presumably you do have another option. You can build a community and do homeschooling. So once you've already went into public school, that seems to me equivalent-ish to you've signed up for the job. Now you have to be held to the standards while you're in there. But you actually decided to go in. You did have another option. You could have done it yourself.
But think of it also like this on the public school aspect. Who got to decide 180 days? Like everyone that's paying the taxes for it, some might go, you know what's best for my kid? 90 days in a public school. In some ways, from the authorities, tough shit. The majority said 180 days. And if you don't do it and you don't have the option for whatever reason of homeschooling and you choose to, on your own judgment as a parent going, maybe there's bullying, maybe you want to travel, whatever. And you're going, no, 90 days is enough. tough crap, you're going to get the truancy officer. And if you say, tough crap to the truancy officer, depending on what state you're in, you as a parent could be put in jail.
I'm pretty sure it's the same here. But yeah.
Well, some of my thinking has shifted on this, particularly in the last 5 years or so, because I just keep observing so many hundreds and thousands of students who are compelled to be inside of a traditional public school, and it's like directly, I would say, causing mental health problems, safety issues, being harmed, like just really, really bad things. And so I would be more or less bothered if the curriculum and what was happening inside of schools wasn't so detrimental to our society, and warping the understanding of the public and even our teachers and our children about what good learning even is. The idea that, oh, well, if you get a good grade on your standardized test, that's how you know you're a good student and you're getting ready for the world. But I also believe in some funding happening, but again, it doesn't necessarily have to come like from public taxpayer dollars. And so I'm trying to like formulate kind of like my position on this, because I like what I'm trying to do is starting a nonprofit foundation where donors can fund scholarships, which I think is kind of in alignment with some of your beliefs, Aquinas, but also that like, do I believe that some of the dollars should come from the government? So far, I think it would be nice, but then like, what strings would that come with? That's where I don't know so much about. But what I will say is that in the IB assessment system, there was a lot of moderation that happened not from an outside authority, but within the community. So even individual teachers could score their own IB exploration papers, but also that there was a lot of moderation from different educators to hold each other accountable. So I think if there is going to be any kind of like accountability, it at least wouldn't come from a government entity that says this is the standard, and if you don't meet our standard, then you're going to face consequences. But I do believe that students should generally be advancing and growing. What does that look like? I think that's going to be different for each student. I generally don't support complete neglect where, let's say, a family just wants their kid to not, let's say, learn in a collaborative, rigorous, or caring way, but that they just believe that their student should, I'll just take a really extreme, almost absurd example, like stay home and don't learn anything valuable because that's just what we believe in. I don't support that. But I generally think that we should be empowering young people to advance toward goals and become ready for the real world. And I think there should be access to that because it does take dollars. And so if you have a poor family, I hope that there would be either charitable organizations or pots of money where families do have at least a great deal of freedom. And so that's kind of like my position. I think I'm not quite where you're at, Aquinas, but what are your thoughts about like mutual accountability that doesn't come from the government, but by, I don't know, community organizations that help kind of with the standard? Let's say that.
It's kind of hard for me to understand exactly like what you're envisioning playing out. Are you almost talking about like if things were trending more towards my ideal or we were there, how might you inspire or address those parents that might be or with your example, who are actually neglectful? I would say, you just have to keep putting your message out there, offering your support, but kind of when we've talked about this, I think a couple of times before, because there are parents that will do that, that doesn't warrant that chains, in my view, through taxation should be put on the parents who will demonstrate or have what I would call more rational approach. I would say we all deserving of the honoring of their freedom and liberty. And even if that happens, that is on those parents. That is still not a justification for a claim on other people's money when it comes to education. And for sure, that would be unfortunate. And again, I would say the people who are most bothered by that possibility step up with your money or your time to try to change that situation.
So here would be kind of a very concrete example. Right now, people who offer grants, like I applied for a small $250 MLK grant to organize an event in January that involved community reflection. And there's a requirement in order to get access to the grant that you show that you did the event and pictures and kind of like a little write-up. So that would be like a base level of accountability that's more than just here's the money, because that was one of the things that Elizabeth brought up was like, should people just get the blank check and then that's it? So for example, like if you get access to grant funds, that there would be some expectation that, if there's a $2,000 grant for STEM and a family really wants to start a robotics competition and get robots and stuff, and then they are awarded the grant, then they go through and they show what they learned and everybody celebrates, and that there's a demonstration of learning.
So I think I better understand now, especially if we're talking about private grants. I think it's fine to have whatever kind of requirements, stipulations, I forget the other word that you used, on those. To give another concrete example, like I'm an atheist. I would have no problem with religious organizations giving grants connected to education. And again, it's their money, and their stipulation is we will grant you this $2,000 related to education, but we want to make sure the teaching of Christ is part of your curriculum. That's private, totally between those two people. And if that is their requirement, it's their money. Like even me as an atheist, I wouldn't go, that's crappy, whatever. At the very least, possibly, I'd go, especially if it came to like very like basic stuff. That kid's still getting to learn how to read and write and do some math. I used it from a Christian organization. Not that there would be some kind of atheist organization, but there could be one that's like, I don't necessarily have this view, but like people are like rah climate change, how they are on that subject. And if their grant, when it came to science, had something about in your curriculum or whatever you do, there is an understanding that your child will come to one of the exhibits that shows the harms of climate change. Again, even though I disagree with the idea of the climate change as far as justification for government controls, that is a private, voluntary exchange. And of course, if you're giving out money, unless you almost really don't care, you're probably going to have some stipulations on what you want that money going to. So I'm broadly supportive of the ability and the rightfulness to do that, even if I might disagree with the particular ideas that in my mind might be promoted amongst the kids. It's private. You as the recipient know that going in. Oh, they're asking me to almost inculcate stuff that my kids or I don't want my kids learning or I don't agree with, and I'm kind of poor, then they will have to make that judgment. What matters more? Or hopefully they can find an organization, or if there's enough of them saying, there's a lot of us poor people and we have these kind of views. Might there be some philanthropist that is sympathetic to them and help us out? And even that philanthropist might have some conditions, even if it was like, we're talking about education, but if it was like food related, that philanthropist might go, make sure you're not just buying the junk food and the junk cereal. And they might even go, instead of us trying to micromanage you on that, we'll just actually give you the food that we think is healthy for your family and kids. And if you're poor, I got some food. Like, I'm happy. Like, I don't get to get my Cheerios, but I got a lot of apples and bananas, and like my belly's still getting full.
So I bring up that concrete example because then I want to go to the next one, because I want to start with the one that I think would be the most private. But I also want to kind of recall your compulsory attendance example, where you're like, at least if you could kind of scaffold. So now I want to address, what if there was public dollars that then there's like a community accountability group. So for example, in the Care Society, not necessarily just someone having full access to public dollars and then, there's no accountability, but that if you're in a community, you're showing that you're learning, there's a process for saying, hey, this is what we're going to use the funds for. Because at least, like, if the current law stands as there are public dollars that get allocated, I'm also trying to think of, like, is there something that I personally think would be fair for the families who feel the need to exit the public school system, but let's say haven't gotten connected with these private donors, and that, like, if there was going to be that those families were going to come together and advocate that, hey, we deserve some of these money, we're taxpayer dollars, but we'll use it for a good cause. I'm trying to think if there could be like a community effort where it's not the government saying, hey, this is what you can spend the dollars on, but that the community says, hey, we agree that this is like good. So it's almost like we're creating like a public grant that has stipulations that everybody agrees on, including the recipients. And then, then we would celebrate whatever learning comes out of that, like the robotics competition that I was just suggesting.
So for me, because there's the public dollar component, now it's a difference in kind, not a difference in degree. So, and I think I kind of know where you're going with. I told you I had an elementary school that I owned from 2001 to 2003, Aquinas Academy of Reason. Obviously, it was a private school. With the environment that is today of what's going on policy-wise, on principle, I would never accept any kind of public funding money at all for my school, like no chance, even if that meant I would go out of business. But like, I am of a certain type of man on this kind of stuff. So I don't really I can't make any comment to what you're saying, because it already grants the premise that is even okay. So my personal position would be, I would never take any of that money. There was for a while, I think it's still the case, Hillsdale College was one of 10 universities, I believe, over the last however many 50, 70 years that refused any kind of government loans to be backing for tuition, to be, when they apply, they accepted no federal money, zero. And they did that on principle. One, because I think to a certain extent, they shared my view, it's not proper for the government to do that. And then in conjunction, to whatever extent you're familiar with the federal backing for colleges, Title X, I think, is the mechanism by which the federal government is able to then say, you need to have these kinds of things going on in your college because they have accepted that federal money. So again, with your example, I don't have anything to say because I would never do that. I don't agree with it. And my school, this is your organization, that's your call. So like, I kind of just have to sit here a little silent.
Yeah, well, you're definitely doing a lot of talking, so I wouldn't say that's silent, but it's really helpful. And I again, the reason I bring this up is because I think there are a lot of families who would be totally fine with them having access to public dollars.
For sure there are.
But
most of America.
But I wouldn't want the government to have the say over whether or not something is of good enough quality to qualify for the funds, just because I think they have no understanding of what good education really is.
And one thing I want to add, though, Jimmy, when you say the government, which is obviously generally representative of the people, and kind of going back to the public schools, like, whatever you and I might think would be better things to be done within the public schools, which again, for me, is a little contradictory. Why do our judgments get to supersede, let's actually give an example of a district, and of the voters, 10% believe what you and I do on that, but the other 90% don't. And we're going, gosh, y'all should really finally figure it out. But we know better, so our thing's going to be implemented. Why is that fair? But even more so, whatever that distribution is, 10, 90, 20, 30, 40, all these different, what I call almost pressure groups in a public school kind of system, who gets to decide and why do they get to decide? In my view, on principle, there's no way to make it fair, because in that environment, someone's judgment is going to supersede someone else's, but whoever is being superseded, their argument could be, but you're still taking my tax money. Why did your views, the Care Society, get to be prevalent? I don't want to generalize too much. I'm a military background, and I want a little more borderline obedience, formality, more of a regimented. I can't argue against them within that system so much, because their money's being taken and now they're going to have to fund it for the Care Society framework, but they don't even agree with it. How is that fair?
Well, the public doesn't decide on our curriculum and assessments. And
it's whoever's in political power.
Yeah. So there are these other entities that the public really doesn't have a say in.
I really want to emphasize truly whoever's in political power. So like in the more Democrat thought of left leaning, when it comes to the Board of Education and those states or those regions within the state, we need to make sure for climate change, to view that as, man is desecrating the environment, basically. You go to a red state and someone else will go, we don't need to be teaching the evolution, or we need to make sure there are Bibles in the school. Again, it's whoever has the greatest political power in that area, their particular ideology gets to underlie the curriculum. But what about all those taxpayers in either example who don't agree with it? They just get screwed.
Can I mention, I just want to make sure I'm understanding right. So would your ideal scenario be like the UK then? Because that's what I'm kind of having to wrap my head around a bit. Yeah, either is really, because I worry that we're making this into more of a political problem than it is, and I think it's more cultural. Because in the UK, we do have traditional schools where enforced curriculum, but we also, you can homeschool your kids and teach them whatever you want. There's not really any check-ins or enforced curriculum. There's no government funding for that. There's no government funding for private schools, and they can teach whatever they want. So is the UK the ideal scenario here?
No. So Jed, let me ask you this. Those homeschoolers and those private schoolers, do they get to go to the UK government and go, we are not using we're not using the public schools. So if you look at our taxes that we pay, can we refrain from paying any portion of our taxes that go to the public schools? No, there's no way they would, because they would die if they were allowed to do that.
Oh, is that what we're asking though? Because I just mean, you can't do that with a lot of stuff though. Like even if you don't drive a car, presumably you still have a road tax. Whereas the idea that we should be getting rid of any tax that we don't use.
I mean, ideally, that broadly that would be my view, but I thought
I wish too, but I just don't see that one happening. So it seems like what's possible seems like the UK has the max situation you'd ever get on this one. I'd have thought, where it's like you have no enforced curriculum, there's no government money in private or homeschooling to enforce anything, and it seems largely free. However, we still have the problem where the UK has by capita far less homeschoolers than you guys do. They're not choosing it. And I think that's what makes it more of a cultural problem than a political one, where parents don't feel they have the tools to homeschool as opposed to the policies aren't in place. Because technically we're more free than you on this one, it sounds like. There's no influence on private or homeschools, but they're still not choosing it. That's what makes me think it's more of a cultural thing.
One thing I wanted to address when, I forget how you phrased it, about like, it was the ideal or this is what it is. I just want to kind of remind, well, to the extent, some of the U.S. history, like until there was people in the, I wish I could remember his name off the top of my head, in the late 1700s advocating like slavery should not be here in America. It took those people, even if it was 40 years, to keep advocating for that idea until it finally changed.
No, I agree. You could speed things up if you do a war, but most things are gradual, and I don't think we want a war over this one. I think it's going to be gradual.
Okay, I hear what you're saying.
I mean, so the biggest gap that I'm thinking through is, one of the reasons why those who are like really pro public school, we believe in equitable access to education, meeting the needs, particularly of low income families, is that if the dollars leave the public school system in any way, then those needy students and families will suffer. But if a student isn't enrolled in their public school, the public schools don't retain any of those dollars. It just gets absorbed into the state and local budgets. So if you are down an enrollment seat, then the school just doesn't receive the funding for that, at least in Virginia, where I am.
So Jimmy, let me kind of have you check on this. If Virginia's public school enrollment has been going down, which I would guess, because I think across the nation that has been happening since COVID.
Yeah, slightly.
Okay, let me know if the state budget for education, the overall budget, has it trended down? I'll bet you $100 right now it has not.
No,
so when you say it gets absorbed, it's the money is still ever increasing, which means more taxes from the people in spite of the enrollment going down. They might start, for pensions or like, oh, we're going to allocate it for more of the resources, but the overall amount continues to grow regardless of the enrollment going down.
I think that has to do with the people who are leaving. It's not so much that you'll really see any actual decrease. Also, it doesn't look good for the overall allocation to go down. But like if the enrollment is down by like 1%, I don't think you would actually see in the yearly budget a 1% decrease. But the amount that is allocated is dependent on the enrollment, at least officially. Now,
and Jimmy, I think that might be like in relation to like particular schools, but then it's just like, but we got more money, the enrollment, so they just end up using it more for the other schools who didn't go down, maybe, or it could be like teacher pay got a little higher, but somehow the amount of money that they keep requiring is still going up, even though. And I bet you in Virginia, the enrollment is down even more than 1% since COVID. I bet you it's probably down 2, 3, maybe even up to 5%. And if by chance it's up to 5%, there was still not even a 1% decrease in the total budget. They just think because education is thought of as a right, that's the justification. We need more of the people's money.
This will be a next idiot question then, but so if the argument is, I don't have a cat in this one, honestly, so I'm just asking like whatever springs in mind. So if people are worried that if less students go into public schools, that reduces the funding, but presumably the funding that's been removed is per student, so it's only the funding that would have covered that one student. So doesn't that mean every other student is exactly the same off because they're still getting the same money per student?
Well, it kind of depends. I mean, one is that Aquinas is correctly stating that overall the budget is still increasing.
But if they get like less students, but the budget's gone up, presumably the argument wouldn't be, oh, the schools are going to get worse for the students. It should be, surely they get better. They've got less students and more money.
There are, for districts where there is significant decrease in enrollment, they will do something like shutting down a school and consolidating. So
Jimmy, I just want to add right quickly to what you're saying. Another thing, Jed, so you're aware, is a lot of times they'll start to cut some programs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that can happen too.
What are programs over there, just to be sure? Like
it could be like the art class or the music class, or more like the kind of the thought of as not so core to like we still got to make sure we have math, reading, and write. But the other I say unfortunate, but you know my overall views. Again, it's whoever's in the political power will decide which of those courses don't seem like they're like we need as bad as the other ones.
Right. So it's that many kids are dropping out that the school becomes unsustainable. It's not that little, like, small pockets of kids are moving out, and then, because presumably it's still, if the ratio is like however much money per kid and you've still got that ratio, presumably the school's still sustainable unless it gets to an extreme example. Or am I missing something?
I'll let Jimmy answer on that one.
Again, I'm coming at this total ignorance, so don't worry if it doesn't make sense on the question.
Trying to make sure I understand your question.
So
try again.
So how much does a school get, like, as an estimate per student?
So it depends on the district and where you live. In Northern Virginia, it's fairly high. It's like $20,000 to $25,000 per year per pupil.
Yeah. So then, if one less student comes in, the ratio of money they get to care for each student is unchanged. So I don't know, unless it's an extreme dropout, I don't know why the quality of their education would dip, because presumably one less student, you've saved the money. You've saved the money anyway. You don't need that funding. Unless I'm missing something.
Depends on the district. And for example, in Prince William County schools, they have like a site-based management program where the money that comes in from the district gets allocated towards individual schools for those schools to have lots of control over. If you only have, like we were saying, like a 1% like reduction in enrollment, even if you have that type of environment, it's not going to affect your budget that much. But if there was like a very large like decrease in enrollment, then it would. I am not familiar with any, like, at least in Virginia, at least in Northern Virginia, none of the districts around here have had such a sharp decrease in enrollment where it really has affected very much. But in other states, it has.
Right. I don't really see the downside then. It seems like if kids want to drop out and do their own thing, what's the problem? If the public schools can still be sustainable enough, just means like one less art class, maybe.
I guess.
Yeah.
So I think it's almost it's like a perception problem, but in my mind, it's kind of a good one. So think of it like this: it's whatever that kind of threshold is that it takes to drop out. At some point, that public school will have to close because they can't justify keeping all the operations going. Let's say there was 500 students and it drops to 350. Well, then you don't need as many teachers. So then those teachers get laid off. So there's that, attack of public school. We're losing teachers. If the drop continues even further and the school has to be shuttered, that public school is probably located in a more miles to time distance to be able to attend. Now you're going to have those students who are originally going to that public school having to have a further drive, which will then affect the busing component to that, and that you have to hire. Then you'll get the grief from the parents who are like, before it only took 10 minutes to get to my school because it was there. That one is now gone. We have to drive all that way. And I think the proponents of the public schools realize, like, if we start encountering that kind of stuff, parents are going to get so pissed and probably say, somehow get more money so we don't have to do that. Or they might go, just screw this and we're out of here. And that will cause a cascade of more implosion, basically.
Do you think it could help public schools then at a small level? Because like I said, the UK doesn't have any enforced curriculum on homeschools and private schools, but our public schools haven't imploded, despite the fact we have that kind of free option to just do whatever we want. So do you reckon pulling some students from could actually create more efficient schools where the teacher or funding to student ratio is actually better?
So Jed, let me quickly say something. You said we haven't had that implosion. If we wanted to take the time right now, I would be curious if we assess the public schools across Great Britain, right? That's the term.
Yeah.
And we said, let's find out how much they can read At what level
I don't
math
think
are
those
they?
are good. I just mean in terms of the actual, they're still around. People
But
aren't.
I'm saying they're still around, and the students don't really know crap, and the parents are okay with them not knowing crap because they don't know that much.
That's what I mean. It's a cultural issue more than a political type one. I'm not advocating that the schools are good. I just mean the idea that if we give home schools and private schools more freedom or funding, that public schools will just die. Ours hasn't. Ours haven't even. So it feels like we'll keep going.
We'll keep this. Well, what will actually, in my view, happen over here in America as the government financed and government defined school vouchers is we'll have parallel systems, all of them now funded by government. They will grow the homeschooling and the private ones now subsidized. They will grow in such a way, and they will start to, and I hope this is okay to say, from the public schools, they'll pull out the brightest kids, the ones who, when I say pull out, those people will get, they're unsatisfied because I don't know if you know what's going on, and I don't know how this is in the UK. Like there's no gifted and talented programs, which are starting to be cut. So if you have, the brilliant kids not getting that, what their parents are thinking of, like challenging type stuff, and you pull out the, let's say again, 300 kids, and you pull out the 30 smartest kids in that school, then the test scores, which is a way that they try to show like the kids are learning something, all of those averages are going to go down, right? Because generally speaking, those kids test better, or they show up better on the test. I'm not saying always, and I'm trying not to use testing as a metric for intelligence. So you're going to have a widening mediocrity within the public school systems. And then if you have the poor problem kids still stuck within them, when I say poor problem, it doesn't mean that wealthy can't be problem too. But let's say the behavioral issue type kids, the ones who do the bullying and stuff, which is already in many ways showing their parents are not involved, they are going to become a greater percentage within the public schools. Like, what are those schools, Jimmy, going to think of, Jimmy, that alternative school that you're at, and, without you labeling your particular students, what if that school was more representative of how all public schools were once the non-problem type kids and the strivers went over to homeschooling or private schools because they've now been subsidized through government finance and defined vouchers? What will the public schools start looking like?
Well, I think that particular school and all schools would look much, much better if students were not forced to learn fake learning. So, the students that I work with at the alternative school were mostly lovely kids who wanted to do real things and were shackled by a system that wasn't designed for them. So they didn't want to come and memorize a bunch of random facts and do standardized tests, but they would love to do vocational programs.
So I hear you on that. So, and maybe I'm not remembering correctly how you described the kind of class, the class culture kind of within the school. I thought, but maybe these kids were referencing their other schools when you said there was rampant bullying, you could smell marijuana. Mm-hmm. Like, those are the kids, depending on how much of a constituency that are in the public school, they're making it bad for everyone. Now, with the vouchers, the government vouchers, the ones that are so frustrated and now have a means to get out, then the population remaining becomes more of that type.
Do you reckon that's actually easier to identify the problem, though? Because otherwise it seems like we've got all these gifted kids, for lack of a better term, in a problematic school where there's rampant bullying and everyone's like being pulled down to level. So it's like, okay, well, gifted kids can go over there and get the education that they thrive with. And now we've got this school that is full of these types of people who are struggling to learn in this environment. It's like, cool, we've got a school where we actually see the problem. These kids aren't learning this way. Now we can actually address it in a way that doesn't disadvantage the other types of kids. So we're like separating the types of learners out. Would that be the counter pro of that? Because the school I went to when I was a kid was definitely one of them ones where it was rough as hell. Everyone was failing. I'm missing a back tooth that got smashed out my face by how bad the bullying was. And both of those schools got shut down and got kind of like converged into one. So it just turned into gang wars of like between the two remnant schools sort of things. It was awful. But that's what I mean.
was going to say, but think of it like if education wasn't thought of as a right, which means, it'd almost all be private schools, all those type of kids, the bullies, and the drug thing's kind of a different thing, not because it's tolerable, but in that environment, other kids who are actually wanting to learn, they were not looking to get high as they're trying to learn. If education wasn't a right and all those kids didn't even get to be in the school, now you have none of those type of kids. Now, Jimmy might go, man, I feel that's unfortunate. Something needs to be done. And my counter would be not a government thing. Jimmy, especially if they bother you so much, you could create the unique school that identifies, hey, if you were thought of as a bully, or if you were thought of as the guy that's always bringing drugs and it's messing up, come to my new place and I'm going to get you in shape. I'm going to make you realize that that is not the course of action. And I would say, good luck to Jimmy, because probably a lot of that stems from the family culture. Now, Jimmy, are you going to be willing to go into those neighborhoods and talk to those parents and say, stop fracking up your kids and raising them in such a way or exposing them to such a thing so that they don't develop that way? Like, that's a lot of work.
Well, definitely it takes a village, and what happens at the home is a huge factor. But I mean, I think you two know a lot of my position on some of this. What the students are actually learning and doing when they're in an educational environment, if they don't want to do that and it's not relevant to what they actually need, we only have a finite amount of motivation. And so the students that are being the bullies, are being violent, are choosing not to go to school, who are rejecting it, if there was something that they wanted to do, they would be much better served. And the students that I personally work with in the alternative program, they were having such a good time. Now, in part, like I'm a great math teacher, but they didn't even want to be on their phones because they enjoyed what we were doing, because the lessons that I was designing were actually relevant to their lives. So when we had an 8th grade like econ and personal finance unit, we were actually looking at real receipts, real sales tax, real percentages, real stores, it was just very relevant. And it wasn't just some contrived, oh, well, in theory, if you have this retirement account, like it was things that they could actually relate to and wanted to learn about. And they got to design the lessons with me. But yeah, like I don't think, even if you could like separate students who are like in a gifted and talented program, but if the other students were still like forced to do fake learning, like that's just never going to work.
That's what I mean. Where it's like you can kind of allow the schools to become specialized, because as I said, in my school, mine was one of those hellish ones, and I was in the gifted talent program, and it was awful. I hated it to the point I had to move schools. But if you actually take all these kids who want to move out, well, now you've got a school of all these kids who are struggling to learn this way, so we can adapt that school more whole, rather than having to like tailor it individually. We can have a school that's maybe more tailored to the types of kids who learn more practically or want to learn more useful skills. It seems like, what's the downside here in giving them that choice or allowing kids to move to wherever suits them?
And I hear you, Jed, and kind of related to that, to add on to what I think Jimmy was at least alluding to, especially if they're teenagers, from my perspective, like, when you're bullying, that's wrong. That's not a right thing to do to another person, or, stealing from them, or again, especially with an example like marijuana and the smoke, is in the air, which will actually affect like your classmate. And they were like, I never agreed to get high. I'm just trying to learn my math. What I was trying to bring home back to what I thought Jimmy was alluding to is, if the type of school is where it's not feeling as relevant, or it feels very authoritarian, or they're almost getting bullying from the adults, going back to that kind of core group of teens, me as an adult thinking, some responsibility, or a lot, your choices, but there's no doubt that there's a lot of acting out, because going back before they were in high school, 5th grade, middle school, it was not in line with what probably would have worked best for many of those different kids. So there will be that, in my view, inevitably acting out, which can take all kinds of forms. But I also want to make clear, like, it's still, I would still, as an adult, go, that is not right what you did to this other student. But me thinking broadly and having care about kids would go, I'm not surprised that you act out so much because you're forced to be in an environment that is not conducive to, if you actually had choice and got to express and go, I want to be doing these kind of things. I might want to spend, 4 hours on this instead of 1 hour breaks. I'm very sympathetic to realizing that's part of what is happening.
Well, I think this conversation, one thing I really like about the culture that we have in the Care Society is that, like, we even took a topic where there are so many terms that need to be clarified. There are like underlying principles, and rather than, let's say, just getting into an argument about school choice, we started to bring it to, like, what are our values? And when we got to some of our first principles, like Aquinas, you have some very strong first principles and beliefs around some of this. Like, we're able to say, okay, I know what Aquinas stands for, and that's how it kind of maps out to how that would apply to education, which I think is really cool. And I think that's how we can have some critical conversations that that people can see where folks really stand or where their positions stem from, and that coming to an understanding about maybe some of those fundamental differences is one way to better understand each other, and to I guess better understand other people's perspectives or their what's behind their position specifically on school choice, which is cool.
What I guess one thing I would kind of add to that, especially it's primarily been us three discussing a little bit, Elizabeth earlier. I feel like, and y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, that we all have an understanding that this is a cultural thing, in which I would view that the culture then affects like the politics, which then plays out in the schools. But from like a broad cultural perspective, we all share a desire that we think the kids, the teens deserve a lot better, a lot more than what they are currently getting. There will definitely be some disagreements on how does that then, how do we apply that given this kind of context? But again, from a kind of global, not like worldly, but global cultural perspective, we want better stuff for the kids. And I think we're in agreement that the vast majority of what they're getting is not great.
Yeah. Well, and I think that goes to show, I think, what a big part of our solution is be thinking about the kids. And ultimately, I think our students deserve to be like thriving in an environment where they have access to opportunity, even if adults have differing opinions about things that are related to education. And if we're going to be free in a free society, we're not all going to believe the same things. But I think if everybody can agree that we want to help the future generation be moving into something that is good and is currently meeting their needs, like I think that's a great place to start. So caring about the kids, caring about each other, and we're going to have differences, and that's okay.
Well, I think the pro side is, because we know it is a cultural issue, that means you don't really have to go to war or do this massive campaign for years and decades on end to change things. Most of the tools that we'd actually need are available to us right now. It's just how do we use them? So I think that's the big advantage Care can have, where it's like, no, you don't need all these programs or schools or anything. It's like you have every bit of information you would ever need in your fingertips. It's literally just how do you use it in a way that is structured to you personally to get the most out of it. So I think that's a massive advantage that people shouldn't be too disheartened by the state of it, when it's like, no, all the tools are there, we just have to figure out how to use them properly, as opposed to having to change an entire country's system, which would be near impossible.
Nearly, but not, other things have changed. Keep going. I'm sorry, Jimmy, I lost my train of thought what I was going to add to that.
Well, let me kind of reflect a little bit. I think I was going into this conversation really hoping to get some public funds for these suffering homeschooling children who don't have the same access anymore. But I think too, some of what we're trying to empower our current students to do is be advocating for their own education and finding fundraising, like from private donors, very similar to what you're talking about, Aquinas. And I I guess that can be done at maybe at scale, particularly if there are kids who can take ownership and go out and find people and put their story out there. I think that could be maybe even better than trying to say, "Hey, government, give us money and we'll do X, Y, Z."
Jimmy, I remember what I was going to say because it's so pertinent, especially, we're talking about just in all societies, different wealths, different income brackets and so forth, and what that can or cannot make possible for kids. But if you look at audience, what we're offering and our particular price points for the different programs, they are not so expensive for your child to be able to be in a loving, caring environment. If I'm recalling correctly, Jimmy, like our lowest price point, isn't it like $50 or $100 a month? And like whatever your income bracket is, and if you agree with these ideas about, our views on how kids should be treated and kind of have access, we are here willing to provide it at a price point that is, whatever your financial situation, if you think about the potential value that could be had from us and our community, it's really not so expensive. So like, give us a call or an email, like try us out.
Yeah. Well, and we also do provide scholarships, and for our base membership is $50 a month, but you can purchase a la carte courses and pod coaching and workshops and those kind of things. But yeah, I also definitely agree that really, really great education can be done for not a ton of money, especially because, like you were saying, Jed, we have so much information and resources available for free online, and in local communities, like your local library, your local even grocery stores or hospitals that are looking for volunteers and can mentor and do apprenticeships, mechanics, those kind
Even
of things.
AI on your phone's better than a teacher now. If you think of one teacher splitting his attention between 30 students every hour, different 30, your phone could give you a text back instantly now with the AI stuff. So I think it's just about giving parents, and mainly parents, just to make that transition, but the students empowered as well, that confidence that no, they won't be weird. No, you're not used to, kids won't be missing out. Literally everything they could need is right there. It's just giving you the confidence to know how to use it in a way that gets the results.
Yeah. So I think one thing about school choice is that it's not just about dollars. It's about students making a choice about their learning and their education. Because if you are a student who can become self-directed and you can use the resources, the people, the any money that you do have online, your local community, if you can take charge and step up and advocate for yourself, you can get educated for negative money, right? Like if you do what our current students are doing, they're putting together a fundraising video, they can earn so much, especially it's around the holidays. Like who wouldn't want to give, we want to make a robot or we want to do an egg drop challenge, but we don't have the resources. Please help us. Like that's cool.
Another quick thing to add to that, Jimmy, is I know that you broadly have encouraged this, and depending on my financial means, I will be implementing it. Like as part of our care organization, and especially connected with our Mighty Networks platform, like many of us adults are looking to pay ambitious teens to help with our own projects.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So we've considered having like a project board where there are access to jobs to be done. For example, like I know a lot of people need help with their social media marketing. They need help with editing videos. They need help with voiceovers or actors for different projects. And for us to connect, especially teens, to some of these like paid gigs, I would love if we could be doing that. And there's a lot of need for good help out there. So we're going to be connecting people with as many resources and opportunities as we can. And to me, that will allow for something even maybe better than what people would traditionally think of as school choice. So maybe let's leave it here, Jed and Aquinas. This is, I think, a very fascinating conversation. It can go in so many directions, things that are related to this kind of policy that we're talking about. But ultimately, we're going to keep caring about the kids, and our choice as a not school, but something that's kind of like a school, is that we're going to keep caring about each other, caring about learning, and empowering young people to thrive and meet their goals. So appreciate you two being here. And I know Elizabeth has been gone for like an hour, but maybe if you're listening still, this has been a pretty long one, which is good. Hope you have a good rest of your day too, Elizabeth, and everybody else. We'll see you next time.
All right. See you.